Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. Why would dozens of strangers show up at a locked gate with coolers and beach chairs, insisting they're invited to a lakefront BBQ on your dock? That happened to me, and the HOA president tried to force the issue in front of everyone. I hit record, opened my folder, and the next 60 seconds flipped the whole neighborhood. Want to know what I played? My family has owned this piece of lakefront property for over 40 years. My dad bought it back in the early 80s when this whole area was just farmland and a few scattered houses. It's not much to look at compared to the McMansions that surround us now, but it's home. The real treasure is our dock, the only deep-water private dock on this side of the lake. Dad built it himself with help from his buddies, and it's been maintained and upgraded over the years. About 5 years ago, everything around us changed. A developer came in and bought up all the surrounding farmland to build what they called a luxury community. They put up these massive houses, all looking exactly the same with their beige siding and perfectly manicured lawns. The whole development became part of something called the HOA, and suddenly we were surrounded by people who seemed to have nothing better to do than measure grass heights and argue about mailbox colors. Now here's the important part that becomes crucial later. When the developer was planning this community, they tried to buy our property too. Dad refused. The developer got pushy, then threatening, then offered ridiculous amounts of money. Dad still refused, so they built around us. Our property became what's called an enclave. We're physically surrounded by the HOA community, but legally we have absolutely nothing to do with them. We don't pay their fees, we don't follow their rules, and we definitely don't answer to their so-called architectural review committee. This arrangement worked fine for years. Sure, some of the new neighbors would give us dirty looks when they saw our slightly weathered siding or our vegetable garden that didn't match their perfect landscape design, but mostly everyone minded their own business. Our property value actually went up because of all the fancy houses around us, so really it was a win-win situation. That all changed on a Sunday in late April when I got back from a weekend fishing trip up north. I'd taken my boat out Friday evening and got back Sunday afternoon, tired but happy with a cooler full of fish. As I was tying up at the dock, I noticed something bright orange flapping in the wind. At first I thought it was just some trash that had blown over from the development, but as I got closer my blood pressure started rising. It was a violation notice, printed on official-looking paper with the HOA logo at the top. The notice was taped right to my boat, this beautiful vintage craft that my dad had restored and passed down to me. The fine was for $250 for something called unauthorized mooring of a non-registered vessel. I stood there for a good 5 minutes just staring at this thing, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I noticed movement up on one of the balconies overlooking the lake. There she was, the woman I'd mentally dubbed Karen months ago. She was the HOA vice president, and she was standing on her deck with a pair of binoculars pointed right at me. When she saw me looking up at her, she actually had the nerve to shout down at me. "About time someone addressed that eyesore," she called out. "And while you're at it, that dock needs a fresh coat of stain. The approved color is almond beige to match the community aesthetic." I didn't even dignify that with a response. I just crumpled up the violation notice and walked back to my house, figuring this was obviously some kind of mistake that would sort itself out. I mean, how could they possibly think they had any authority over my property or my dock? The paperwork was probably just meant for someone else and got delivered to the wrong place. Boy, was I wrong about that. The next week passed normally. I went to work, came home, did some maintenance on the dock, and enjoyed my evening beer watching the sunset over the lake. A few times I noticed people from the development walking along what used to be a path that cut across the corner of our property. Dad had never minded people using it as a shortcut to get to the lake, so I didn't think much of it. But then Thursday evening I came home to find a group of teenagers jumping off my dock into the water. Not just 1 or 2 kids, but maybe 8 or 10 of them, with towels and coolers spread all over my dock like they owned the place. I walked down and asked them what they thought they were doing. The response I got nearly made my jaw drop. The HOA newsletter said this was a new community amenity, one of the older boys said, like he was explaining something obvious to a confused child. Our usual beach area is under renovation, so they opened up this dock for everyone to use. Community amenity, my dock. I felt my face getting hot, but I kept my voice calm and told them this was private property and they needed to leave. Most of the kids seemed genuinely confused and apologetic. They really did think they had permission to be there. but a couple of the older ones got mouthy about it, saying they'd check with their parents and the HOA board about whether I was allowed to kick them off a community dock. After they left, I went inside and did some deep breathing exercises my wife had taught me. This was clearly getting out of hand, but I figured I'd just need to have a conversation with whoever was in charge over there and clear up the misunderstanding. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. 2 days later, I found another notice stuck to my front door. This one wasn't just about the boat. It was a final demand letter threatening legal action if I didn't immediately pay not only the original $250 boat fine, but an additional $150 for failure to maintain community standards. Apparently, I was being fined for not putting up seasonal floral arrangements on my dock pylons. Seasonal floral arrangements on dock pylons. I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. The letter went on to explain that as a waterfront property owner within the community boundaries, I was required to follow all landscaping guidelines, including the spring requirement for appropriate seasonal displays on any structures visible from the main lake area. At this point, I realized I was dealing with people who had completely lost touch with reality, but I'm a reasonable person, so I decided to handle this the civilized way. I looked up when the next HOA board meeting was scheduled and marked it on my calendar. The meeting was held in the community center, this fancy building they'd built in the middle of the development. I'd never been inside before, but I had to admit it was pretty nice. There were about 50 people there, mostly couples in their 50s and 60s, all looking very serious and official. I waited through about 20 minutes of incredibly boring discussion about things like pool hours and dog waste policies. Then they got to what they called enforcement actions, and my name came up. The board president stood up to address the room. I'd seen this guy around the neighborhood before, a tall, thin man who always wore a suit even when he was just checking his mailbox. Someone had told me he was a retired lawyer, and he definitely acted like he thought he was still in court. "We have an ongoing situation with the property owner at the lakefront enclave," he began, and I knew he was talking about me even though he didn't use my name. Despite repeated notices, this individual has refused to comply with community standards and has actually prohibited residents from using the South Dock facility. South Dock facility. He was talking about my dock like it was some kind of community infrastructure. Furthermore, he continued, this individual seems to believe that their property is somehow exempt from HOA authority. I want to make it clear to everyone here that when your driveway connects to an HOA-maintained road, you have what the law calls implied consent to HOA bylaws. No one gets to pick and choose which rules they follow. The room was nodding along like this all made perfect sense. I felt my blood pressure climbing again, but I forced myself to stay calm. Then he dropped the real bombshell. I'm pleased to announce that after extensive negotiations, the South Dock is now officially open for community use. We'll be hosting our annual summer BBQ there in 6 weeks, giving all residents the lakefront access they deserve. The room actually applauded. 50 people clapping for the announcement that they could use my dock for their party. I stood up. The room got quiet, and the board president looked at me with this smug expression like he was expecting me to apologize and beg forgiveness. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice level, "but I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. That dock you're talking about is on my private property. I've never given permission for community use, and I'm certainly not part of this HOA. The board president's smugness cranked up to 11. "Sir, as I just explained to the room, your property access creates implied consent to our authority. If you refuse to pay the legitimate fines you've been assessed, we'll be forced to place a lien on your house. I suggest you reconsider your position." A lien on my house for boat and flower fines on my own property. I looked around the room at all these faces staring at me like I was some kind of troublemaker trying to ruin their fun. The board president was clearly enjoying having an audience for his little power trip. "I see," I said finally. "Well, I guess I need to think about this some more." And I left. I could hear the murmur of conversation starting up behind me as I walked out, but I didn't look back. On the drive home, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. These people had just declared war on me, but they'd made 2 critical mistakes. First, they'd done it in front of 50 witnesses. Second, they'd given me 6 weeks to prepare. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and drove to the county clerk's office. I requested a certified, stamped copy of our original property deed from 1983, plus the most recent land survey that had been done when the development was built. The clerk was incredibly helpful, and within an hour I had a thick folder of official documents that told a very clear story. Our property was completely separate from the HOA development. Not only were we not required to follow their rules, but there was actually a specific legal designation protecting us as a grandfathered parcel that couldn't be forced into any homeowner association without our explicit written consent. But the really interesting part was the survey map. It showed the exact boundaries of our property, including the shoreline and a small section that I'd always thought of as just the corner where people cut through to get to the lake. According to the official survey, that wasn't a public easement at all. It was part of our property that people had been crossing with our informal permission. I spent that evening reading every document twice and making phone calls to 3 different property lawyers. By the time I went to bed, I had a plan. I'm not a vindictive person by nature, but sometimes people push you past the point where being nice is an option. The HOA had lied to their own members, threatened to put a lien on my house, and announced they were throwing a party on my dock without my permission. They'd made this personal, so I was going to make it educational. The next morning, I called a fencing company that specialized in security installations. I explained exactly what I needed and where, and they sent someone out that afternoon to give me a quote. The price was higher than I'd expected, but considering what I was preventing, it seemed like money well spent. 3 days later, the installation crew showed up at 7 in the morning. By noon, there was a beautiful black steel security gate right at the property line, exactly where the survey showed our land began. The gate was 6 feet high, professionally installed, and came with a very secure lock. But the gate was just the beginning. I'd also ordered signs. Professional, weatherproof signs that looked official and serious. They read, "Private property, not part of community HOA. Trespassers will be recorded and prosecuted. To request dock usage, HOA board must pay a $5,000 daily user fee in advance." I posted these signs at 3 different spots along our property line where they'd be clearly visible to anyone approaching from the development. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Within hours, my phone was ringing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I let them all go to voicemail. The messages were interesting. Some people sounded confused and apologetic, asking if there had been some kind of mistake. But others were angry, demanding that I remove the gate immediately and stop blocking community access. The best call came that evening from the board president himself. His retired lawyer voice was shaking with rage as he left a 3-minute message threatening everything from legal action to code enforcement investigations. He ended by saying that I'd picked a fight with the wrong person, and that he'd make sure I regretted this childish tantrum. I saved that voicemail. I had a feeling it might come in handy later. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated in predictable ways. Someone called the county to complain that I'd blocked a public access route, but a quick check of the records confirmed that the path had always been on private property. Someone else called the sheriff's department to report that I was restricting community amenities. But the deputy who came out to check things out took one look at my property deed and survey and told me I was well within my rights. The HOA tried a few more official-looking notices, but I just threw them away. They had no legal authority over me, and we both knew it. But the really entertaining part was watching the neighborhood drama unfold. Apparently word had gotten out that the promised lakefront BBQ might be in jeopardy, and people were starting to ask difficult questions about what their HOA fees were actually paying for. I could see little groups of residents gathering in the streets, having what looked like pretty heated discussions. The board president tried to hold an emergency meeting to address the current crisis, but from what I heard through the neighborhood gossip network, it didn't go well. People wanted to know why the board had promised access to property they didn't own, and why no one had bothered to check the legal status before making announcements. 3 weeks before the planned BBQ, things got really interesting. I was working in my garage when I noticed a small crowd gathering near the gate. It was mostly people I recognized from the development, and they seemed to be taking pictures and having a pretty animated discussion. Then someone started shouting. I couldn't make out the words from where I was, but the tone was unmistakably angry. I walked closer and saw that the board president was there, red-faced and gesturing wildly at the gate and signs. I couldn't resist. I walked over to the property line, staying on my side of the gate, and asked if there was some kind of problem. "You know exactly what the problem is," the board president snapped. "This illegal gate is blocking access to community property." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "I'm sorry, but this is my private property. I have the deed and survey right here if you'd like to see them." "I don't care what fake documents you've produced," he shot back. "That dock has been designated for community use, and you can't just decide to lock people out." Perfect. I let him keep talking for another minute, getting more and more worked up, until he actually said the words, "I don't care if you think you own it, the HOA board has authority over all waterfront facilities in this community." Then I stopped recording and smiled. "Thank you for clarifying the HOA's position. I'll make sure to include this conversation in my documentation." The look on his face when he realized what he'd just said on camera was priceless. As the date for the BBQ approached, the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to cut with a knife. I'd hear cars driving slowly past my house at all hours, and I could see people on the balconies and decks overlooking the lake, probably trying to figure out if there was some way to access the dock without going through the gate. A few people tried to approach me directly. Most were polite, explaining that they'd paid extra HOA fees specifically for the promised lakefront access, and asking if we could work something out. I felt bad for these folks. They'd been lied to by their own board, but I wasn't about to reward the HOA's deception by giving in. 2 days before the BBQ, I got a visit from someone I hadn't expected. A woman in her 60s knocked on my door and introduced herself as a member of the HOA board. Not the president or the vice president, but one of the regular board members. She looked uncomfortable as she explained that she'd just learned about the property ownership situation and wanted to apologize for the confusion. According to her, the board president had assured everyone that he'd taken care of the legal details regarding dock access, and the other board members had trusted his expertise. "We never would have approved this if we'd known the real situation," she told me. "Most of us had no idea that your property wasn't part of the HOA. We're going to have to cancel the BBQ and figure out how to explain this to everyone." I appreciated her honesty, but I told her it was too late for that. The damage was done, and I wasn't going to let the board president save face by quietly backing down. If they wanted to cancel their party, that was their choice, but I wasn't going to help them cover up their mistakes. Saturday morning arrived sunny and clear. Perfect weather for a lakefront BBQ if you happen to own lakefront property. I made coffee and sat on my deck to watch the show. Around 10 in the morning, cars started arriving. Lots of cars. People came with coolers and folding chairs, kids brought pool floats and water toys. It was clearly going to be a big party. By 11, there had to be 60 or 70 people gathered at the gate. I could hear confused conversations as people tried to figure out why they couldn't get to the dock. Some folks were reading the signs I'd posted, and I could see them pointing and gesturing as they discussed the situation. Then the board president arrived. He parked his big SUV right in front of the gate and got out like he owned the place. I watched him march up to the gate and start yanking on it, apparently thinking he could just force it open. When that didn't work, he turned to the crowd and started giving what looked like a speech. I couldn't hear everything from my deck, but the key words carried clearly across the water. Illegal obstruction, community rights, and take action were repeated several times. The crowd was getting more agitated, and a few people started shouting agreement with whatever he was saying. That's when I decided it was time to join the party. I walked down to the gate, staying on my side, and pulled out my phone again. The board president saw me coming, and his face turned an interesting shade of purple. "Ladies and gentlemen," I called out, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'd like you to know that your board president has been lying to you." The crowd got quiet. I held up my phone and pressed play. The recording from 3 weeks ago came through loud and clear. The board president's voice saying, "I don't care if you think you own it. The HOA board has authority over all waterfront facilities in this community." I let that sink in for a moment, then continued. "This is my private property. My family has owned it for 40 years. We are not members of your HOA. We don't pay your fees, and we don't follow your rules. Your board promised you access to my dock without my permission and without any legal right to do so." I pulled out the folder of documents I'd gotten from the county. "I have the deed, the survey, and legal confirmation that this property has never been part of your development. Your board president knew this when he promised you could use my dock for your party. The crowd was turning to stare at the board president, who was clearly trying to figure out how to spin this situation. But before he could say anything, I played another card. Furthermore, I announced, your board has been misusing your HOA fees. They've been paying for maintenance and improvements to my property without my consent, probably billing it as community amenity development. You might want to ask for an audit of where your money has actually been going. That got a reaction. People started talking all at once and not in a happy way. I heard someone shout, "What do you mean our fees?" And someone else yell, "How much money?" The board president was trying to restore order, but it wasn't working. People were angry, and they were starting to direct that anger at him instead of me. I decided to add one final touch. Since your board seems to think my property is a community asset, I've prepared a bill for services rendered. I held up an official-looking invoice I'd had printed. $5,000 per day for dock usage, plus consultation fees for explaining basic property law. The total comes to $37,500 for the time period since they started advertising my dock as a community amenity. The board president finally found his voice. This is ridiculous. You can't charge the HOA for... For what? I interrupted. For using my property without permission? For lying to your members? For threatening to put a lien on my house? Which part exactly is ridiculous? At that point, several people in the crowd started shouting questions at the board president. Someone demanded to know how he could promise dock access without checking ownership. Someone else wanted to know how much money had been spent on lake improvements. A few people were taking pictures of my property documents. The board president tried to rally support by claiming I was being unreasonable and selfish. But it was too late. Too many people had heard too many contradictory explanations, and they were putting the pieces together. The crowd started to disperse, but not before I heard several heated conversations about calling emergency board meetings and demanding resignations. Someone mentioned getting a lawyer to review HOA financial records. Another person was talking about organizing a recall vote. I stayed by the gate until everyone left just to make sure there weren't any problems. The board president was one of the last to leave, and as he walked past me, he stopped and glared. "This isn't over," he said quietly. I smiled and held up my phone, which was still recording. "You're absolutely right. I'm sure the county attorney will be very interested in hearing about HOA boards that make unauthorized use of private property and threaten homeowners with illegal liens." He turned pale and walked away without another word. The fallout was swift and comprehensive. By Monday morning, I'd gotten calls from 3 different local news stations wanting to do stories about HOA overreach. The county attorney's office reached out to ask if I wanted to file formal complaints about the threats and unauthorized use of my property. But the most satisfying development was what happened within the HOA itself. Within 2 weeks of the failed BBQ, a group of homeowners had organized a recall election. They'd also hired an independent auditor to review HOA finances, and apparently the results were very interesting. It turned out that the HOA had been billing regular maintenance fees under creative budget categories for years. Community amenity enhancement had included things like pressure washing my dock and paying for landscaping around my property line. Waterfront access development had covered the cost of the path maintenance across my land. The board president resigned before the recall vote could happen. The vice president, who'd been watching me with binoculars, was voted out along with 2 other board members. The woman who'd apologized to me was elected as the new president, and one of her first acts was to send me an official letter acknowledging that my property was completely separate from the HOA and apologizing for the previous board's actions. They also paid my consultation fee, $37,500, delivered by certified check with a note saying they hoped this would close the matter permanently. I have to admit I felt a little bad taking their money. Most of the homeowners were decent people who'd been misled by their board. But I'd made my point, and they'd learned an expensive lesson about the importance of checking facts before making promises. The best part came a few weeks later. It was a gorgeous summer evening, and I was sitting on my dock with a cold beer, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and orange. The water was perfectly calm, and I had the whole place to myself. As I sat there enjoying the peace and quiet, I noticed movement on one of the balconies overlooking the lake. It was the former vice president, the one with the binoculars. She was standing there looking out at the water, probably wishing she could access the lake without having to drive 5 miles to the crowded public park. She saw me looking up at her, and for a moment we just stared at each other across the distance. Then I raised my beer in a little salute and turned back to watch the sunset. Some lessons are worth every penny you pay for them, and some are worth every penny you charge for them. I had a feeling that everyone involved in this mess had learned something valuable, even if they didn't all enjoy the experience. As the stars started to come out over the lake, I realized that this whole situation had actually worked out better than I could have hoped. My property rights were firmly established, the HOA had new leadership that understood boundaries, and I had enough money in the bank to make some improvements to the dock that had caused all this trouble in the first place. But mostly, I was just happy to be sitting on my own dock, on my own property, without anyone trying to fine me for the privilege. The story didn't end there, though. Over the next few months, word spread through the local community about what had happened with our HOA. I started getting calls from other people who lived in HOA enclaves or who were dealing with overreaching boards themselves. One guy called me about his vegetable garden that the HOA was trying to force him to remove, even though it was on land that predated the HOA by 20 years. Another woman was being fined for parking her work truck in her own driveway because it didn't meet aesthetic standards despite being grandfathered under the original development agreement. I shared the name of the property lawyer I'd consulted with and gave them copies of the research I'd done on enclave rights and HOA authority limits. It felt good to help other people stand up to these petty tyrants who seemed to think a position on a homeowner board gave them unlimited power over other people's lives. The former board president tried to make trouble for me one more time. About 2 months after the failed BBQ, I got a visit from a code enforcement officer investigating complaints about unpermitted structures on my property. Apparently, someone had filed reports claiming that my dock was built without proper permits and that the new security gate violated setback requirements. The investigation took about 30 minutes. The code enforcement officer checked the permits on file for the dock, which had been properly filed and approved back in the 80s, and measured the gate placement, which was exactly on the property line where it belonged. He told me that whoever had filed the complaints clearly didn't know what they were talking about, and that I shouldn't expect any further issues. As he was leaving, he mentioned that this wasn't the first bogus complaint he'd received recently targeting people who'd had disputes with their HOAs. Some folks just can't let things go, he said with a shake of his head. I had a pretty good idea who was behind those complaints, but there wasn't much point in pursuing it. The complaints had been investigated and dismissed, and frankly, I was more amused than annoyed. The fact that the former board president was still so worked up about losing to me just confirmed that I'd done the right thing. Summer turned to fall, and life settled into a comfortable routine. I spent many evenings on the dock, sometimes fishing, sometimes just enjoying the peace and quiet. The new HOA board sent me a holiday card in December with a note thanking me again for my patience during the transition and wishing me well in the new year. The former vice president with the binoculars moved away sometime around Thanksgiving. I heard through the neighborhood gossip that she'd gotten tired of the drama and decided to find a new community where she could start fresh. Her house sold quickly to a nice young couple with kids who wave at me when they see me on the dock. As winter set in and the lake started to freeze over, I found myself reflecting on the whole experience. It had been stressful and frustrating at times, but ultimately it had been worth it. Not just for the money, though that was nice, but for the principle of the thing. Too many people in positions of small authority think they can push others around just because they can get away with it. They count on people being too tired, too busy, or too intimidated to fight back. But sometimes you have to draw a line and make it clear that there are consequences for overstepping boundaries. The HOA learned that lesson the hard way, but they learned it thoroughly. The new board has been respectful and professional in all their dealings with me. They haven't tried to extend their authority beyond their actual legal boundaries, and they've been careful to check facts before making promises to their members. My dock is still mine, my property is still private, and my beer still tastes great when I'm sitting by the water watching the sun set. The gate stays locked, the signs stay posted, and anyone who wants to use my dock better be prepared to pay the daily rate. Some people might think I was too harsh in how I handled the situation, but I don't see it that way. The HOA board made deliberate choices to threaten me, lie to their members, and claim authority they didn't have. They could have apologized and backed down when I showed them the property documents, but instead they doubled down and tried to intimidate me into compliance. The consequences they faced were entirely proportional to their actions. They lost credibility with their members, they had to pay for their mistakes, and they learned that property rights actually mean something. Those are all good outcomes that will benefit everyone in the long run. And on warm evenings when I'm out on the dock with a fishing line in the water, listening to the gentle lap of waves against the pilings my father built, I can't help but smile at the memory of that failed BBQ. 67 people standing at a locked gate, slowly realizing they'd been lied to by the people they'd trusted to represent their interests. It was an expensive lesson for the HOA, but some lessons are worth every penny. The new year brought some interesting developments. The replacement board members they'd elected turned out to be much more competent than their predecessors. Instead of trying to expand their authority, they focused on actual community improvements and transparent financial management. They hired a new management company to handle day-to-day operations, and apparently one of the first things the new managers did was conduct a comprehensive review of HOA authority and legal standing. According to what I heard from neighbors, they identified several other situations where the previous board had been overstepping their bounds. One of my neighbors mentioned that the HOA had quietly settled with 3 other homeowners who'd been subjected to invalid fines and inappropriate enforcement actions. Nothing as dramatic as my situation, but still cases where people had been pushed around because the board assumed they could get away with it. The audit results were finally published in the spring newsletter, and they were eye-opening. The previous board had been creative with budget categories, using HOA funds for things that clearly fell outside their authority. My dock maintenance was just one item in a long list of questionable expenses. But the most interesting discovery was that they'd been planning to eventually claim my entire waterfront area through something called adverse possession. They'd been maintaining the path across my property and encouraging community use, apparently hoping to establish a legal claim to at least part of my land. That explained a lot about their aggressive tactics. They hadn't just been power-hungry bullies. They'd been setting up a long-term legal strategy to steal my property. When I put up the gate and forced a confrontation, I'd actually disrupted a plan that had been years in the making. The new board president called me personally to apologize when that information came to light. She seemed genuinely horrified that the previous board had been plotting to take someone's property through legal trickery. "We want you to know that the current board has absolutely no interest in your land," she assured me. "We're focused on managing the properties we actually have authority over, and we're committed to respecting everyone's property rights." I appreciated the call, and I told her so, but I also made it clear that the gate would be staying up permanently. Trust, once broken, takes a long time to rebuild, and I wasn't taking any chances with future board elections. As spring turned to summer, I started getting inquiries from people wanting to rent dock space. Word had apparently spread that there was private deep water access on the lake, and boat owners were willing to pay premium rates for convenient docking. I wasn't interested in becoming a commercial marina, but I did rent space to a couple of neighbors who lived in the development but owned boats. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now making money from the very resource the HOA had tried to claim for free. The rental agreements were carefully written to establish that this was purely a commercial transaction between private parties with no community access or HOA involvement. My lawyer reviewed every word to make sure there were no loopholes that could be exploited later. 1 year after the failed BBQ, the new HOA board decided to hold their community event at the public park instead. I heard it was actually quite successful, with better facilities and more space for activities. Sometimes being forced to find a real solution instead of trying to steal someone else's resources leads to better outcomes for everyone. I spent that evening on my dock, as I do most summer evenings, watching the sunset and reflecting on how much had changed. The gate was still there, the signs were still posted, and my property rights were more secure than ever. But the atmosphere in the neighborhood had improved dramatically once people learned to respect boundaries and work within proper legal channels. The former board president had moved away sometime during the winter, apparently finding the social situation uncomfortable after his schemes were exposed. The former vice president's house had been bought by a family with teenagers who were perfectly happy to use the public beach facilities instead of coveting their neighbor's private dock. Life had settled into a peaceful routine that I expected to continue for years to come. My property was protected, my rights were established, and I had a comfortable nest egg from the consultation fees the HOA had paid. But most importantly, I had the satisfaction of knowing that I'd stood up to bullies and won. Not through violence or destruction, but through patience, preparation, and the proper application of legal principles. Sometimes the system works exactly the way it's supposed to, especially when people are willing to do their homework and stand their ground. As the stars came out over the lake, I raised my beer in a silent toast to my father, who'd had the wisdom to buy this land and the courage to keep it when the developers came calling. His investment in waterfront property had paid dividends he never could have imagined, in ways that had nothing to do with money. The dock he'd built with his own hands had become the center of a battle over property rights and community authority, and it had held firm against every challenge, just like the man who built it, and just like the son who inherited it. Some things are worth fighting for, and this little piece of lakefront paradise was definitely one of them. Anyway, thank you for watching.